All right, guys, welcome back. This is the second part of an article review that I'm doing on concussion, pathophysiology, and injury biomechanics. Last time we went over the neurometabolic cascade, which is the first section in this article. The next section and then the following subsections under that are what we're going to be going through today, which is titled Subacute Pathophysiology. Okay, so it's again published in Current Reviews, Musculoskeletal Medicine, and it's going to be cited in the description as usual, so you can follow along if you want to. So the introduction is going to be the same. So I really want you guys to understand that we're talking here, setting the stage for mild traumatic brain injuries. Okay, not moderate or severe brain injuries. This article is looking specifically for mild traumatic brain injuries. And I'm not going to insult your intelligence. Once again, you can read the definition that they give, but MTBI throughout the article, lowercase m, capital TBI is how they denote this in the article. So last time we ended with axonal and cytoskeletal problems. So now that we're in the subacute pathophysiology, or usually that means in the world of injuries, anywhere from 24 to 72 hours after. Okay, so they looked at something, they talk about something called functional anisotropy. Okay, so I don't know a ton about this since it has to do with imaging and it's very intense and dense, the reading up on this, but essentially it measures the water diffusion in white matter, or the axons. And we've talked about axons before. Those are involved in transmitting the signals back and forth in the actual neuron. So you have the cell body of the neuron, then you have the axon, then you have the dendrites. So those are the main three parts of the neuron. The axons are the white matter. Okay, so they're the long part of the neuron. It then goes on to say something about the acute effects of the ability for water to diffuse in and out of cells and how that correlates, or specifically neurons, how that correlates with post-concussive symptoms. So they've been able to kind of correlate this idea of this FA measure, the functional anisotropy, they say FA, when it talks about that linear water diffusion in the direction, not only does it talk about the amount of water, but the direction of water diffusion going in and out of the cell. And they've been able to correlate either the increase or decrease in this number with post-concussive symptoms. So that's very important to be able to find things that correlate with symptoms so that we can use them to target for treatment. And then it goes on to talk about something called myelin water fraction. And so this is MWF, as they noted in the article. And it talks about the ratio of myelin-associated water with total water, in the local environment, local cellular environment, or even extracellular environment, I think, but don't quote me on that. So this MWF is generally not considered to be a good thing if it's higher. Okay, so in fact, they saw that in contact sport players, it was higher than in non-contact sport players. So if we're going with something that we've seen in the past when we talk about CTE, the primary mechanism are these subconcussive blows. Now, that's not what we're talking about here, but we can see that if they're in contact sports and that MWF is higher in folks that play contact sports versus those who don't, then there might be some sort of relationship there. Okay, so there's just something to keep in mind whenever they're looking at like subacute pathophysiology, which is the name of this section. Okay, so neuroinflammation, or inflammation of the nerve cells. So the first part of this, it talks about the increase in inflammatory markers that potentially contribute to cell damage. And so if you've ever taken like a physiology course, you'll know that like cytokines and interleukins, I think the article specifically mentions like IL-1B and IL-6, but those are inflammatory cascades that happen whenever tissues in our body incur damage. These are natural processes. And they are hypothesized again to correlate with concussion symptomatology. So if you have a headache, or you have issues listening, or you have photosensitivity or sensitivity to light, some of those concussion symptoms can be correlated with an increase in inflammatory markers with blood work. Okay, neuroinflammatory markers specifically. And then the presence of some of these inflammatory biomarkers are more likely to exist in people that experience persistent post-concussive symptoms and even cognitive impairment. So not only does it give us a little bit of an insight on something that we could potentially use to target as a potential treatment, which I think it goes on to mention in the article, it also gives us a little room to discuss maybe what it looks like down the road if there's an acute on chronic issue, or whenever they're later on in their if athletes are later on in their rehab, we can almost use this as a measure to say, okay, there's less neuroinflammation. Does this mean that they are getting better? Or is this just a proxy measure for something else? Okay, so that's just another thing to keep in mind. Neuroinflammation is something that people have targeted, or that physicians and people who look and study this have targeted to try and see and relate it to the severity of these mild traumatic brain injuries. Okay, and cell death. Now, one of the first things it says in this article, or in this section, is that more than likely it's seen with moderate to severe TBI. It's much more common to see somebody who's undergone a really heavy traumatic brain injury have cell death associated with it, and the markers that would lead us to believe that cell death has occurred. But one of the most interesting things to me about this article was that it said that some of these studies that they've done on humans showed decreased volume in various brain structures after an NTBI. So that's something. These mild traumatic brain injuries are definitely something to keep our eye on, because it can give us a view into what's to come whenever people are progressing through their rehab. Okay. Now, it does say that some of these structural changes can resolve after a year, but whenever we start to talk about decreasing the volume, it just intuitively this makes sense. In the structure of our brains, we don't really like to see that. We see this in some of neurological diseases and dementia, and we even see it in CTE. So just whenever you start to talk about the changes in the size of the structures of the brain, that really should catch your attention here. But again, this is mainly seen in moderate to severe TBIs. So another thing to keep your eye on if you have your finger on the pulse of some of these things, or you're worried about it in your training. So the discussion, we're just going to go over different parts of what we talked about. I know this is a relatively shorter video, but I still like to kind of recap. And then when we get into the implications, you guys won't hear that because it's only the Patreon members that get access to that. So if you want to hear more of that, this will kind of fade away, and then you can go over to the Patreon. It's only $5, and then we'll talk about it, and you can also ask questions in the respective sections that I've created there that are about the channel at large. So the first part, we talked about some of the structural damage, those ongoing axonal and cytoskeletal issues that talk about the altered water diffusion in the white matter, or the axons. You can see the picture here. It then goes on to talk about neuroinflammation, okay, especially acutely in those mild traumatic brain injuries that can affect the healing capacity, and talks about some of the cellular damage that's incurred in that neuroinflammation process that could prolong some of the healing if left untreated, or if you don't get treatment right away. And then cell death, even though we mainly see it in moderate to severe brain injuries, some of the volume and changes can occur. They've seen this in human studies. So this is something that they're probably going to investigate in the future, or continue to investigate and see if there's any relationship there. So overall, this is kind of what we're looking at when we talk about that subacute phase of mild traumatic brain injuries. Next time I post a video on this article, that'll be the last one. We're going to talk about the actual biomechanics, the angular and linear velocities that we've talked about in some of the last videos. But this was the discussion section. I thought it was pretty good to break this one down into acute, subacute, and then the actual biomechanics. If you're just watching on YouTube, it's going to be the end of the video. If you're on the Patreon, I'll see you when we go over there. Thank you guys for watching.